time from your schedule, as we know that meeting today is amid unprecedented challenges to our healthcare systems, especially those serving children, as we tackle concurrent outbreaks of COVID, RSV, adenovirus, and the highest levels of influenza A we've seen in years. So the good news is that we may be seeing the peaks of disease in the coming weeks, hopefully even before the holidays. If the experience in Australia, which precedes our respiratory season, is similar here, their decline in influenza A cases was just as steep as their uptick. So I am hopeful. So this lecture series, it goes back to Dr. Jerry Burton, Patricia Burton, Dr. Richardson K. Noback, our founding dean, and our funder, Dr. Jim Risco, 1975 School of Medicine alum. So Dr. Burton has long been recognized as the first graduate of UMKC. He joined the inaugural class of students in 71 and graduated in 73. Now that seems like a short medical school career. In fact, he had a doctoral degree in pharmacology and was both a student and instructor in the earliest years. Patricia Burton started her career as an educational advisor at the School of Medicine, and she and Dr. Burton were married in 1973. After graduation, Dr. Burton trained in internal medicine and pulmonary medicine and practiced in Overland Park. Patricia trained as a counselor and gerontologist and continues her practice today. After retiring from clinical practice, Dr. Burton taught the history of medicine course in the humanities department that is led now by Dr. Brian Carter, and this department opened in 1992. Later, Dr. Jerry and Patricia were persuaded by Dr. E. Gray Diamond, our school's founder, to author a book on the history of our medical school. The book, which lists the publication date of December 25th, 2014, just a little more than a month after Dr. Burton's untimely death, is titled A Proven Experiment Looking Back at the UMKC School of Medicine. It includes the voices of graduates and UMKC leaders, and it centers around Dr. Diamond's vision of our academic plan. Dr. Jim Risco, who graduated from UMKC in 75, was close with both the Burtons and with our first dean, Dr. Richardson K. Noback, providing the funding for the lectureship in their honor. Dr. Noback, who was involved in the original planning for the school. Just a reminder to mute yourself if you are Zooming. Maybe Christopher Boyce can. Dr. Noback, who was hey, Valerie, we can hear you talking. And thank you for muting yourself, and thank you for Christopher for assisting with that. So Dr. Noback, he was involved in the original plan in 1950. He was the dean of this school, our founding dean, from 1971 to 78, then became a senior docent. And a docent in our system is an advisor, a mentor, a leader of small student groups, and he fulfilled this role as a senior docent for a dozen years. Known as a consummate teacher and role model to our students, Dr. Noback has continued to be engaged at the School of Medicine. For those of you who know him, on November 7th, he turned 99 years of age. And while he remains active in the School of Medicine, on a daily basis, I will tell you, including attending in person our 50th anniversary gala in June, he's unable to be with us today. He sent an email, though, to me. These are regular emails I receive. I wanted to include his best wishes to all attending in person and remotely, along with his compliments to our distinguished speaker, who will be guiding as well as engaging minds today. He and Patricia Burton, who is here with us today by Zoom, both express their deep appreciation, as I do, to Dr. Risco, who has made this series of lectures possible. So the inaugural lecture in this series was focused on what doctors do outside of medicine. It was the vision of Dr. Risco to really enrich the lives of our students by thinking about what they can do beyond the practice of medicine. So our first lecture was on April 28th, 2016. Dr. Patrick Taylor spoke on the art of storytelling. Dr. Taylor earned his medical degree in Belfast and practiced in rural Northern Ireland before specializing in OBGYN. In 1970, he and his family immigrated to Canada, where he focused on a really illustrious academic career that included teaching and research in human infertility. He received multiple awards for his academic work, but then he turned to pen a series of Irish country novels that revolved around a fictional small-town country doctor, and he read from his book at that inaugural lecture and gave it to our students to have fun, and that he hoped that the humanities faculty would bring a personal touch to their education. So this lecture followed by a series of interesting lectures, each with a decidedly unique focus within medicine. In 2017, Dr. Kamaji, Vice Chair of Education at the University of Toronto, presented on Ways of Seeing, Ways of Knowing, a Role for Humanities in Medical Education. And in 2018, Jeremy Green from Johns Hopkins University presented on the electronic patient and medicines and challenges of new media. Last year, a pandemic year, Dr. Kevin B. Churchill, President and CEO of Boston Children's, spoke on the impact of COVID on healthcare systems and on really how physicians were navigating this space. From the beginning, this lectureship has allowed us to honor our history, and today I want to especially acknowledge Dr. Risco. I know Dr. Noback and Patricia Burton, who have been steadfast supporters of our lectureship from the beginning, also want to honor you today, Dr. Risco, and thank you for your continuing support. This year, we are privileged to have as our speaker Dr. Abby Rosenberg. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Brian Carter, our department chair and the Searage Endowed Professor, to introduce her.
Thank you, Dean Jackson. It is a distinct honor to invite and present to you our guest for this Noback-Burton lecture. Dr. Abby Rosenberg practiced in Seattle, Washington. She was trained at Stanford University Medical School, graduated in '06, if I'm not mistaken, and then further trained in both pediatrics and pediatric hematology oncology at the University of Washington and Seattle Children's. Beyond that, as if it's not enough, she's taken on specific niche foci, palliative care, survivorship, cancer survivorship, focusing on adolescents and young adults in particular. And it is with this background that she was tapped on the shoulder recently by none other than Joanne Wolfe from Boston Children's, who established both the Division of Palliative Medicine at Dana-Farber and Boston Children's, and is now moving on to become the department chair at Mass General. Tapped Abby Rosenberg on the shoulder and said, I think you should come here, and others obviously found that that was a wise choice. And so Abby is in the process now of leaving Seattle and moving to Boston, where she will direct the palliative care division and basically the pediatric advanced care team, where our own Dr. Jenny Linebarger trained in palliative care after her adolescent fellowship in Rochester, and then came to us in 2011 at Children's Mercy. So it's my pleasure to introduce Abby Rosenberg to you to deliver a talk today on resilience, something that we can learn and practice with our patients and the communities we live in. Abby.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I have a little mic here. Thank you for the kind introductions and for the invitation. I'm really grateful to be here. A little bit about the science and the art of resilience, essentially what we've learned from the patients we've worked with, the clinicians we've worked with, and the communities we have worked with. Let's see. So I like to begin when I talk about this with this question of why resilience in the first place. Resilience has become kind of a cliche over the last couple of years, and I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of this talk. When I began, though, what Dr. Carter didn't tell you about me is that my first career was as a social worker. And I worked with kids with HIV sort of at the end of the HIV epidemic in New York City. And At the time then, and then throughout my medical training that followed, I always had this question why there were certain kids and families who seemed to figure it out, if not thrive, and others who really, really seemed to struggle. And the question I had then, throughout my career and still now, is what would happen if we figured out how to harness that resilience and teach it to the families who were struggling? And if we did that, could we achieve this goal we all have of alleviating suffering and improving quality of life? So it turns out that's actually harder to do than you might imagine. The word resilience comes from physics and material sciences, where it is defined as a capacity of a material to absorb energy when it's deformed, and then upon unloading, have that energy recovered. So the classic example is a rubber band, right? You stretch it, it bounces back to its original shape, it's resilient. How do we translate that to people and families? When I started this work, one of my mentors said to me, well, Abby, if you want to change something, you have to be able to measure it. So when you're talking about resilience, what are you actually talking about? And that was a difficult question for me to answer, and here's why. When I was beginning all of this work, there was a lot of controversy in the resilience world, in particular amongst psychologists and social sciences, about how we define and operationalize resilience. This is work done by a psychologist researcher named George Bonanno, who's one of the pioneers in the field. And what Dr. Bonanno studied was bereavement. And so here you're looking on the horizontal axis is time, and on the vertical axis is levels of distress or depression. You see 3 different lines. They represent 3 different groups of people who are marching through their lives until a traumatic event happens. Here it's the death of their spouse. Following that, there is this expected normal spike in distress, and then you see 3 different lines representing 3 different trajectories towards wherever folks are going to end up. What's always been interesting to me about this image is that it in some ways illustrates what was the controversy at the time about how we define resilience. So there was a group of people who would look at this graph and say, resilience is on the far left. It is defined by some perhaps immutable trait or characteristic, and you either have it or you don't. And sure enough, there's a group of people, that line dot dot line group, who for whatever reason were predisposed to some negative outcome. They were therefore not going to be resilient. And we as clinicians could maybe identify who those folks were, but we might not be able to change where they end up. There was a second school of thought that would look at this graph and say, no, resilience is defined in the middle. It's how we adapt and cope to whatever is our new normal. It's how we change over time to get used to whatever it is we're living with. And here folks would look at that middle group and say, well, they started off pretty distressed, and they kind of ended up pretty close to back where they started off. Like that rubber band was stretched and it over time got back to its original shape, therefore they're resilient. And then the last group of thought was that resilience was defined on the far right. And often it was defined after a particular amount of time had happened, and after more often than not, it was somebody's doing better than you would expect after this particular trauma. And in this case, somebody who was no longer bereaved, who had somehow gotten back to their baseline, was considered resilient. So I'm going to tell you that when I was starting my career, Jenny and I were just talking about this, I hated all of these theories because they didn't quite map onto what I saw as a clinician. And I'm going to share with you the many questions that I came up with, at least at the beginning. The first was, is illness an isolated event? Can you draw a single vertical line on the illness experience? Or when we talk about resilience and illness, do we need to draw multiple lines? And then what would this graph look like in that case? Who's the unit? Are we talking about our patients? Are we talking about the family? Are we talking about the community? Are we talking about ourselves as clinicians? Because how you answer that question is going to define what you mean when you're talking about and measuring resilience. Is there a difference between getting through an adversity and growing from it? There's a lot of controversy on this one. For me, it was talking with bereaved parents and saying, you know what, I got out of bed today. I think that makes me resilient. And other people would say, no, they can't be just getting out of bed. They have to be connected to society again. So where's the line between failing to thrive and being resilient? Which outcomes matter and to whom? So I take care of teenagers and young adults. If I'm taking care of a young person with cancer and that person's taking his chemotherapy, I might think he's pretty resilient. His mom might think he's resilient if he's going to school and meaning his coursework, and he might think he's resilient if he's not depressed and has friends. Who's right? How do we integrate individual differences? My resilience is probably very different from Jenny's, and it's very different from Brian's. How do we decide that when we're measuring this in population health? And then last, how do we integrate cultural differences into this field of study? I'm going to pause on this last one because this to me has been really interesting as this has evolved. So here in the United States and in Eurocentric cultures, we have these ideas that that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, no pain, no gain. We have these ideas that grit equals hardiness equals resilience. That's actually not true in most of the world. While every single culture we have ever studied can describe how people get through hard times, very few have words for resilience. And those who do include some of these. So in Southeast Asia, resilience is equated with a sense of balance. In Latin American cultures, resilience is equated with upholding of societal and cultural values. In the Middle East, resilience is equated with mastery. In Native American cultures here, resilience is equated with spirituality. And in most languages in the world, there is not actually a translation for resilience. And when there is, it is usually the Americanized back translation to something that we value, and they have decided to define themselves. So in the midst of this debate, there was this plenary panel in 2013 at the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, and they got all these resilience researchers up on stage, including Dr. Banana, who I just told you about, and they said, tell us why you think your resilience theory is the right one. And you're looking at a picture of a woman named Catherine Panterbrick. She is a cultural anthropologist. This is at a different meeting. But what Dr. Panterbrick does is she studies different societies through ethnography, which means she goes and she bears witness. She basically lives with people who are going to university. She sort of says, what do they do? And what Dr. Panterbrick noticed was that in every single community, in every single trauma, and every single type of adversity, what she saw was that people were harnessing resources to themselves. And so what she said is, resilience is a process. It's a process of bringing those resources to ourselves, where they are, in order to sustain our well-being. And what is fascinating to me is when you pull all of the literature from all of the different types of adversities we find, those resilience resources that people harness always fall into these three buckets. Number one is external resources. Who helps us? Our social support, our community. Number two is our internal resources. These are things like grit and hardiness, inherent traits, but they're also the processes we learn along the way. And then last, existential resilience resources are things like meaning-making, faith, spirituality. That sort of inherently human thing that we do, which is, what does this mean for me and my family? Why is this happening? So that theoretical underpinning felt really important to me and really unwieldy as an investigator. And around the same time, I stumbled across a different social and psychological theory, which is called stress and coping theory. And what stress and coping theory really boils down to is that our perceptions influence our outcomes. So this is a simplified schematic of what stress and coping theory would say, which is we experience a stressful event. The first thing we do is we appraise it. Is this good or bad? Is this manageable or catastrophic? And how we answer that appraisal question defines how we cope, feel, and how we function. And what stress and coping theory would posit is if you can change the valence of the appraisal from catastrophic to manageable, you can change all of these other outcomes. That felt more manageable to me. So we started to do some work and we said, does someone's personal appraisal of their own resilience translate to outcomes? Because that proof of concept felt really important. And so we used a validated survey that asks someone essentially, how resilient are you? How resilient do you believe you are? With a validated tool. And we first worked with about 120 parents of kids with cancer. We asked them to fill out this survey, and then we compared it to the population. And what we found, parents of kids with cancer reported lower resilience than the rest of their peers. There was something about witnessing your child go through cancer that made people feel like they were less resilient. Then we looked at the folks in this cohort who had the lowest resilience scores versus the highest, and those who reported low resilience were the ones who went on psychological distress, they had ongoing sleep difficulties, and important to me as a clinician, they were the least likely to be able to tell their medical team what they were hoping for or what they were worried about. Similarly, this idea of how we appraise our resilience turns out in other populations. So this was a large study from the U.S. Health and Retirement Survey. It included over 11,000 adults from the United States who were at least 50 years old, up to the oldest person in this cohort was 98. They followed people over time. They asked them to fill out the same type of survey, how resilient do you believe you are, and watched what happened. And so two gentlemen who were matched in every single way, except one believes he's resilient and the other doesn't. Let's say they're all going through their lives. They both fall down and they break their hips. The gentleman who believed he was resilient is more likely to go to physical therapy, get back to his activities of daily living. And the one who, again, for whatever reason, didn't think he was as resilient, not only doesn't do those things, but his life expectancy is shorter. So I started to take these theories. Hi, for those who are just joining, please mute. Thank you. And I started to try to think, like, how do you translate this into something we could do for patients and families? So the first thing we did was we went directly to our stakeholders. We worked with parents of kids with cancer who were both bereaved and non-bereaved. We said, how did you do this? What was it like for you? What would you like to tell a parent who's in your shoes now? And parents said, resilience is who I was, what I learned, how I ended up, and what it all meant. This was a person who literally looked at that banana graph and was like, oh no, it's the left, middle, right, and kind of the whole thing. Or resilience is facilitated by who I am, who helps me, and what I believe. This is a person who looked at those resilience resource buckets and said, all three of those things matter to me. Around this time, I started integrating patient stakeholder perspectives, and I want to introduce you here to Daniel, who was not only one of my patients as an oncologist, but he was one of our key stakeholders in all of my research. And what that means is every time I interviewed somebody, Daniel and I would meet afterwards. Hearing, how would I apply this to a patient like you? And over the course of our relationship, cancer progressed, and towards the end of his life, we started talking about how can you be resilient if you are dying? And he said, Abby, cancer happened to me for a reason. It was to help others like me understand and to make it easier for them somehow. And so with Daniel's help, we interviewed teens and adults with cancer at the beginning, middle, and end of their cancer therapy. And then every year after that, some folks we interviewed for a decade. And we continued to ask them, know what you know now. What is this word resilience? How are you resilient? How could we help other people to be resilient? And what teenagers said is resilience depends on the person and their experiences. It's kind of like exercising. You have to gain muscle before you run a race, personal strength. Or resilience is how well you rebound from something, like being able to fight back. It can be taught and it should be taught. And so we heard this loud and clear and we were like, okay, how do we teach this? What are the things that have helped people to be resilient? So we took over 200 hours of interviews with these teens and young adults, and we distilled it down to this, which is, in their experience, resilience is more like a teeter-totter, and at any given moment, you can kind of tip the scales towards feeling more or less resilient. And if you believe, as I do, that someone's perceptions of their own resilient are the thing that drives their outcomes, you really want to try to tip the scales towards people believing that they are more resilient at any given moment. And what we heard from patients and families is that contributing factors like being able to manage your stress, being able to have goals, being able to stay positive in the face of all this adversity, being able to find meaning and purpose, and being able to maintain your sense of connection and social normalcy. And what we noticed is two things. Number one, these are resilience resources. These are those buckets, just put in your terms. And number two, these top four are things that you could teach to an individual patient, whereas social networking and supporting a group seemed like a different kind of intervention. And so we decided to try to target these top four skills that we had heard from patients and families mattered and see what it would look like if we taught them directly to others. So that leads me to really the bulk of a lot of what I'm going to talk about next, which is the Promoting Resilience and Stress Management intervention, which we call PRISM. PRISM is essentially those four skills distilled into a curriculum that can be reproduced and taught at the bedside. We teach stress management through 3 mini skills. The first is simply a deep breathing technique so people can kind of calm themselves down. And then we do 2 progressive mindfulness skills. One is a deeper relaxation called guided imagery, just helps people calm their mind. And the last is something that helps people to become aware of what's stressing them out without judgment. It doesn't fix the problem, it just them name the problem. After that, we do a goal setting module. This is something in medicine many of us are familiar with. We teach people SMART goals, which stand realistic and time-dependent goals. In the cancer world, it was, I just want to be done with my cancer, turned into something with small incremental positive steps that could be measured by a patient so they feel that forward momentum and that sense of progress. After that, we teach something called positive reframing. In psychology terms, this is called cognitive restructuring. It is where the stress and coping theory hits the mark. It is how you help people to recognize how they are appraising something and start to shift the valence of that appraisal. It doesn't mean, ooh, cancer's the best thing that ever happened to me. It's cancer is not the worst thing that has happened to me, or I can do this today. And then last, meaning making is helping people to identify that benefits, gratitude, purpose, legacy. Answer that question, what does this mean for me now? We teach all of these through a script at the bedside, one-on-one. In the era of COVID, we turned it into a video-based intervention. After all 4 of these coaching sessions, we have a family meeting, what we call coming together, where the person who received the intervention can teach back to their loved ones what they learned. It helps reinforce the skills, not only on their part, but also on the part of the family. And then in between the whole thing, we have boosters and worksheets and opportunities to continue to practice the skills. So the first thing we did was we said, okay, is this actually feasible? What do people think about it? And so we delivered the PRISM program to teenagers and young adults who had either cancer, diabetes, or cystic fibrosis. And across the board, they said things like, this is so helpful, I wish we'd done this sooner. Yeah, I was actually telling my friends about it afterwards, and they said they would try it out. Or I used to be in the hospital and think it was a waste of time and not want to be there. But doing things like this make you realize you're here to make yourself better. 80% of the people we approached enrolled, and 100% of the people who started the program finished it. So then we did a randomized trial amongst teens and young adults with cancer, and this is all of the study data in one slide. So I'm going to orient you a little bit. The horizontal line means there was no change between groups who either got PRISM or usual care. Those blue bar graphs are demonstrating the point change in the validated instrument, so up or down. D is a statistic we use in behavioral sciences called an effect size. By convention, any greater than 3 is considered clinically significant. And most of us are familiar with P, which means it was statistically significant within this study. And so moving left to right, people's sense of resilience went up, their psychological distress went down, their hope went up, their benefit finding went up, and their quality of life went up in both clinically and statistically meaningful ways. What we weren't looking for, and what we found later on, was 6 months after the study, amongst the teenagers and young adults who are still alive in this cohort, that was 74 of them, 21% of the usual care versus 6% of the PRISM patients met criteria for clinical depression. And that translated to a nearly 90% reduction in the odds of being depressed within those first 6 months. So that's the happy part of my story. That's the early career success part. And I really want to sort of share with you how we started to learn and need to change action a little bit at this point. So the first thing we heard over and over was, my mom needs this too. Or a mom saying, I need that too. Or a brother saying, can I have that too? There was a high demand for this type of program. And we started to figure out, how could we expand this to something that can help the whole family? We adapted the program for parents. And our question for the parents was, it's really hard to get away from the bedside. So is it better for me to sit across from somebody and do the same weekly coaching thing and take their time, or do we need to think about how to do this in a group setting so that parents can be around other parents and they only have to get away for a big, long kind of training day? And so we ran a randomized trial where we tested the adapted one-on-one version versus usual care and a group version versus usual care. This is a forest plot demonstrating the differences between groups for people who got one-on-one PRISM coaching versus usual care. And here you can see that parents who got one-on-one coaching again reported higher resilience and higher benefit findings. So it seemed like this one-on-one coaching program was working for parents. And then here's the group versus usual care. The takeaway from this forest plot is that there was no difference. PRISM as a group didn't seem to work. Our conclusions were initially that maybe group learning is harder, maybe it wasn't enough time to develop the skill, maybe there's a whole bunch of other pedagogical reasons that this is a problem. And yet, part of the group format was that the parents in a group could maintain connections with one another, and they could rely each other to talk about their own resilience resources. And we actually thought that this would augment their resilience within the group. And about 2 weeks after one of the group sessions, the daughter of one of the dads died unexpectedly. And we, as a study team, were not really sure how to handle that. So we reached out to the dad, and we expressed our condolences, and we sort of gave him an invitation to drop out of the study. And he said, no, actually, I have talked with my other group members, and I want to share with you the email string that has come from this. This is what he said. This is him writing to his group. I think about all of you often. I've had many chances to use the strategies we used. And then one by one, he names every single PRISM skill and how it helped him in those first 2 weeks since his daughter's death. Interestingly, I feel better as I type this. I don't have an extensive support network. It's literally myself and my wife. This is the only time I have talked about what I am feeling. Thank you all for reading this and staying in touch and helping each other through this. So I still think the group doesn't teach individual resilience skills. I also think the group does something valuable. And what we're missing in our field of research so far is figuring out what that value is and how to measure it in a way that can continue to help families. The next thing we heard from patients and families was that our little paper pencil worksheets, which we gave them, were like, in the words of my teenager, lame. They didn't want these things that for me had been how I had learned how to do work. They said, we want this at our fingertips. We want this in the middle of the night when I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I can't control my thoughts. So bear with me because I'm going to show you, I have to bow out of this to show you the video. Here. We were going to have a nice little video for you, but let me just show you. So this is, we built an app. This is the home screen of the app. So when a person will log in to practice their resilience skills, this is what they see the first time. So essentially what they do is we teach them all the skills and then they have this tool at the bedside for them to practice whenever they want. And they can upload what they're grateful for, they can maintain their goals, the app will help them track their own sense of stress and resilience.
Is this a proprietary app or is it on App Store?
Oh, it's a good question. For those who can't hear in the audience, the question was, is this a proprietary app or is it in the App Store? It is in the App Store, but it's not publicly available without a download code because we still use it in our research. All right, the next thing we learned in these sort of twists and turns post our initial success was that when PRISM works right away, it seems to continue to work for people. So these are 2-year later follow-up data from that first randomized controlled trial. And the blue dots are folks who got usual care, and the blue triangles are folks who got PRISM. And moving sort of left to right, panel A is quality of life, B is hope, C is resilience, and D is psychological distress. And the takeaway here is that folks generally started around the same point, and then within the first 6 months of the program, their lines diverged. And then if they were on one of those divergent response lines and they got PRISM, they tended to stay somewhat better than the folks in the usual care group. And so here the takeaway was, how do we make sure we optimize that divergence and ensure that people who get PRISM are really responding quickly? So from there, we launched a bunch of different studies to try to answer some of these. PRISM's cost effectiveness, its impact on end-of-life decision-making by integrating concepts of goals of care and advanced care planning into the program for kids with advanced and incurable cancer. We started looking at ideal delivery strategies to boost that initial effect, and many mentees started taking this in different directions and exploring its role, for example, amongst patients who experience racism from their healthcare providers. Dr. Lau, a different person who is studying how best to disseminate and implement the digital health components of things like PRISM. Another investigator at CHOP is looking at how PRISM can help teens and young adults with chronic pain. We have another investigator who's looking at adults with congenital heart disease in that transitional period between pediatric and adult care. Can skills help folks with that at readiness? We have another researcher who's looking at how PRISM can be used as a platform to build additional social relational coping efficacy skills. This is essentially, how do I know what I care about for my social networking, and then how do I self-advocate for that to maintain my... And last, how do we measure physiologic biomarkers of stress and resilience, and do programs like PRISM actually change the physiology of what's happening inside our bodies? So that was where we were 3 years ago. And then the pandemic hit. And this, people needed to go home. They were taking care of their kids at home. Kids were at school at home. Burnout hit record highs that we still have not recovered from within the healthcare industry. And so we were asked really quickly to pivot the PRISM program and create things that would help hospital networks. And so we created, this first thing was an infographic. You can see is essentially the PRISM skills, and it was put up on hospital walls across the country as a sort of makeshift, here's something you can do to build resilience right now. We then adapted the program on demand for kids in schools and healthcare workers, and we tested this in 2 little studies. The first was a pilot study delivered into a single classroom within the public school system in Seattle, and kids, parents, and teachers, 100% of them were satisfied. 100% of them recommended this program as a routine thing that we should do in schools, and kids' resilience went up, parent resilience went up, teacher resilience went up. The next thing we did was a larger study of an adapted program within Seattle Children's and the University of Washington, where we translated PRISM to a group classroom format, and we taught it within cohorts of people who work together. And here, 91% of people reported satisfaction and 89% recommended the program to their peers. And again, resilience went up, hope went up, anxiety, stress, and burnout all went down. I want to pause, though, because one of the things that really bugged me about this work was the idea that the onus of being resilient is on each individual healthcare worker. We have done this a lot over the last decade, where there is this sense that if you are resilient, you won't burn out. And if you are burnt out, it is up to you to fix your burnout by becoming more resilient. There's a problem. 80% of burnout in healthcare is from the system. It is from things like our EHR, from pre-authorizations, from the work hours. It is not something that an individual can fix. And so I've really struggled with this latest turn in our field of research, which is how do we integrate resilience and burnout work together? The first thing we took away during the pandemic is that it is even more difficult to be resilient when you feel undervalued or disrespected. We learned this really quickly in the last 3 years. So I don't think I need to remind everybody that there are a lot of disparities in the healthcare industry. Women compared to men are less likely to get the startup packages. They're less likely to get promoted. They're less likely to be in leadership positions. It is exacerbated if you are a person of color. And what we had to do during the pandemic was to say all of that is true. Those are systematic problems. But what happens to the lived experience of people who feel that sense of being less valued on a day-to-day basis? And so we did a survey in our Department of Pediatrics at the University of Washington. And what we found was akin to what we've seen in a lot of other departments and disciplines. Number one, the vast majority of women report, experience, or witness harassment on a daily basis. And the vast majority of men, I'm sorry to say, don't even think harassment happens. And so that's a problem because the folks who are in leadership and power just don't see the problem, and the folks who are experiencing it do. So then we asked people, how does this make you feel? What's your story? And this is a word cloud of the descriptive words that people use in their day-to-day experience in our hospital. disrespected, unrecognized, harassed, dismissed, devalued, uncomfortable. Imagine going to work every day when this is your adjective. It's really hard to be resilient. So we started to think about, okay, what's the solution to this on the systems level? If we really say it's not fair for you to be expected to practice your every day, can we change the way we are valued? And so we started thinking about professionalism in medicine, and I think, many of you will appreciate professionalism is one of those sort of nebulous things we talk about. It's sort of like, I know it when I see it. And we've learned in the last few years, in addition to the pandemic, that professionalism is also inequitable. There was a Latina woman who showed up to her board exam wearing big hoop earrings, and she was dinged for being too cultural in the way she presented. So we wrote this essay in the cancer world where we said medicine is facing a dangerous lack of accountability. We know that diversity, equity, and inclusion in our work support productivity, personal and professional well-being, and positive patient outcomes. We know that a lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion does the opposite. We know that building a diverse and inclusive workforce requires diverse and inclusive leadership. People need to see that their leaders look like them and believe that they belong. We know that half of medical students are women and half identify as not white, and yet in most instances we seem unable or unwilling to promote, sustain, and enable their representation. So we're failing to practice that DEI we preach. And so we said, what if we change the way we define professionalism to integrate this DEI that we all seem to care about? So I'm just going to share with you, the American Medical Association has this code of professionalism, which I think is sort of bonkers. So it includes treat the sick and injured with compassion and without prejudice, or refrain from supporting or committing crimes against humanity. So basically, if you don't break the law, you're professional, I think is what the AMA is proposing with that last one. And I think we can do better. So we came up with some other measurable things that would change how we think about professionalism. Can you practice cultural humility with your patients and colleagues? Can you explore and integrate diverse cultural norms? Or on the bottom half, do you demonstrate intolerance of discrimination? All right, pandemic lesson number 2 was this. Resilience became not only trendy, it started being trite, if not overused, and irritating to the communities who were really feeling the stress. And we were working with a lot of communities of color and folks who were experiencing poverty or displacement during the pandemic. And what we started to hear was this: stop calling me resilient. Stop using that word. Stop making that the excuse. Fix the problem. And so we decided that this demand for resilience resources isn't equitable, and that efforts to promote resilience have to include individual and systems change, much like how we have to change the system in healthcare to alleviate burnout. We went back and looked at some of our earlier work to try to understand how much this matters. And I'm going to share with you 2 different studies that seem to conflict with one another. The first is we looked at the program's efficacy by race and neighborhood poverty. And we found that folks who identified as a race other than white and folks who lived in poorer neighborhoods didn't respond as well to PRISM, which makes total sense, because if you can't put food on your table and somebody comes in and says, let's practice mindfulness, it's probably irritating to you. But then we did another analysis where we looked at people who had experienced a prior traumatic event in their childhood called an ACE. And here, people who had experienced a prior adverse childhood experience, including really significant traumas, seemed to respond even better to PRISM. So this is what I've been thinking about the most recently, and we're trying to sort of reframe how we theorize resilience. So bear with me while I try to explain this. I think this is a new kind of teeter-totter. The things that potentially harm our resilience are these taboos around the word. We do need to name and champion people's resilience, but we can't when people hate the word. There are historical and persistent traumas that make people not want to talk about it because they want to fix those traumas instead. And there are taboos around people's identity that make it hard to talk about this. I think that is going to hinder our ability to heal. Instead, what we need to do is tip the scales towards recognizing that resilience really is something to be championed. We need to triumph history, so recognize the struggles that people have gone through in the illness community For example, this is recognizing, hey, maybe a decade ago something really hard happened to you. How did you do that? Let's remember why you are resilient as an individual or as a community, because that is actually going to help you now. And last, let's help people be proud of their background and their heritage. Let's talk about those things and make people feel like this is something to accelerate. All right, so we have a couple of new studies that we are just launching over the last year. The first is, can a combination of concrete research and PRISM improve outcomes amongst families of kids who live in poverty and also have cancer? My colleague Kira Bona is in Boston. She has an intervention that deals with concrete resources. In her study, parents who got this concrete resource intervention had household material hardship alleviated, but they were still psychologically distressed. In New York, parents who got PRISM were still psychologically distressed, but less so if they happened to live in a poor neighborhood. So what would happen if Kira and I combined our programs? And so this R01 is going to launch here this year. I have a colleague at St. Jude who is adapting the program for youth with sickle cell disease. And in particular, she's working with them about how do we get around the taboo of resilience and how do we turn this into something that you're proud of. And then Dr. Crystal Brown and Jill Steiner, who are two people at the University of Washington, two of my mentees, are expanding their research to systematically measure and account for social determinants of health and think better about how we operationalize this tool. Right. Pandemic lesson number 3 is that processes of resilience have predictable and overlapping phases, and they are often not linear. So the way I think about this now is resilience begins with this idea that we just have to get through the day. This is that bereaved mom who was like, I got out of bed today. That counts. So it's when we put one foot in front of the other. It's when we're like, literally like, I have no idea how I'm going to get through tomorrow, but I'm going to get out of bed. And that's okay, because the uncertainty is too much. At some point, what we know in every adversity we've ever studied is that people do start that process of harnessing their own resources. At some point, they shift. And in between, they start assessing their situation. And they can say, what have I done before? Or we can say to them, what have you done before? And we can move them from this, I just got out of bed, to I'm actually moving forward. The last phase that we see is this idea that people look back and learn, and that is when they start to reflect and they start to do that appraising and they start to think about, what is this going to mean for me in my future? And in between harnessing of resources and that reflection is when they start to think about who they want to be at the end of it. And in between the looking back and learning and those days where they're like, wait, nope, I just came out of bed again, that's when they start appraising the situation and trying to understand what it means. And that can feel overwhelming, which is why sometimes they toggle back and forth. So really quickly, I'm going to close with where we're going next. We have started to really think about how do we expand this and revision what will help our communities at large. And the ways we're thinking about this is, how do we serve new communities? For example, how might we learn, identify, and expand things like PRISM into communities in need? How do we meet the needs of people in the moment? We're not going to fix the trauma that happened 10 years ago, but we can help them with the trauma that is happening right now. How do we do that? And how do we effectively deliver a program like this? And so within the first bucket, if you will, we have created co-design and adaptation processes with priority groups. We're essentially going to our stakeholders and helping them to help us design a new program. And then these latter two categories, we have a central coaching pool now. We're doing experiments where we're trying to figure out how much of the app alone versus in-person coaching do people need to respond? What's the best way for us to expand this? And I'm going to close with some final words from Daniel Marr, who said to me, you have to work sometimes to be happy, to move past the hard, the sad, the scary. We all do it. But maybe you need help sometimes. Maybe you need a little bit of learning or a little bit of strength or remembering what matters or a little laughter or a little love. Figure out what you need and hold on. But please, whatever you do, live the time you have with meaning and purpose. I have many, many people in the Palliative Care and Resilience Program that we started in Seattle to thank, as well as all the folks who have worked with us over the years on these projects and our funders. I want to thank everyone here for inviting me again. It is such an honor to be here. And I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions.
Hi, I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, have you studied sibling survivors of a child who died? And if there is divergence on whether their parent, I've seen this so often, a parent who is unable to get out of bed and the parent who is trying their hardest, what happens to that person in the middle, that child, survivor, sibling? And then the other question, it links back to Dr. Rico's comment, and that is on the healthcare worker side, where individuals are feeling undervalued and disrespected. What is your advice to those who are in systems where leadership is not enlightened and it's not likely going to change? So I have two very different questions
Two
for you.
super easy to answer questions. Okay. We have not looked specifically at when you have different parents who are coping different ways. We have looked at bereaved sibling outcomes, both immediately and long term, and one of the most important contributing factors to how bereaved siblings do is, in fact, how well included they were in the other child's end-of-life experience. So siblings, for example, who had an opportunity to say goodbye, do better longer term. So that leads me to your question, which is if you have two parents who are in different places and maybe yes or no allowing the sibling to come into the room and do their own pre-bereavement and post-bereavement work, what do we do? Anecdotally, I can tell you more often than not, parents are in different places because they're each going through their own grief and their own coping mechanisms. And as I said at the very beginning, we all do this a little bit differently. I think what we as clinicians who take care of families need to understand is that that sibling is part of the family, and how we recognize that sibling can be part of the conversation with the parents. And I'm looking back at Jenny, and this is what we do in palliative care, is we try to recognize and anticipate that when the child who's our patient dies, that sibling is going to need some help too. And so how can we do some of this work? It's really, really difficult.
It is. I'm thinking of a family particularly, many families that I've encountered over the years where, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, this with then that growing sibling in the middle.
Yeah, it's really hard. I'm realizing I should have repeated the question. So I just answered the question about what do we do when a sibling has a parent who has been able to cope with, recognize the grief, and then another parent who's still really resisting the death of their child even a decade later. The other question was
Enlightened leadership.
Was about leadership that may or may not be enlightened, and how do you tackle some of these things? So in these two papers that we wrote from this analysis in Pediatrics, we actually tried to provide some tools. And then the first one that is published in Pediatrics, we talked about what our department did with those data. So we did this survey early in the pandemic. The data were shameful in some ways to see the degree of harassment in the stories that women and folks have reported. And kudos to our department chair in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Washington, because she said we need to share the story and we need to fix this. So we started to do a lot of really talking about the problem and bias interruption training and things that I think we all try to do now and becoming more and more prevalent. I really think that the sticking point is going to be destigmatizing people who point it out and making it safe to feel like all learning. It's not my intention to be disrespectful. We want to give people the benefit of the doubt. We also need to give people an opportunity to learn and move. And so that is the part that's going to be really hard, because nobody wants to be told that they're not being respectful. Which leads me to how important it is for your leadership to be on board with this. And if you have leaders who are more resistant themselves, then it becomes that much more difficult. I think the other thing we learned from this was in the second paper, where we really qualitatively analyzed people's experiences, what most people said was, I have people around me who help me. And so people's immediate peer cohorts and their immediate leadership. So even if it's not your department chair or your dean, if you're division head or your team leader, that matters. And so we need to help people to coach within their programs and advocate. And then even those who didn't recognize recognized the problem said, shoot, I wish that I had been told that. How can I become more aware? So I think it's just going to take us a long time, and that patience is going to be a thing, but I think it's important, yes.
So I'm feeling much more resilient.
I'm so glad.
Through my lack of attention to detail, I missed the email about this lectureship that I had endowed. So I was feeling very sorry for myself, very undervalued, disrespected. And all the way up here, I had a big headache on. I was going to be mad and yell at Marianne. I have to tell you, I've been going to lectures at Harvard for 50 years, and this is the best lecture I've heard in many, many, many years. Thank you very much for this. I just wanted to say I've been doing emergency medicine for about 50 years and lived through the Hyatt disaster here in 1981 and the Joplin tornado in 2011. And I've watched how communities respond both acutely and chronically because, particularly in a small town, I wind up taking care of patients for years. So watching the acute stress and how people handle that, and then the people that are survivors that are resilient versus the people that chronically can't get past that. You know, I recently went through the death of my spouse, an illness with my son, and I had some of these coping skills when that was going through. So thank you very, very much. This is a very, very clear-headed lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to Noback to say the same thing.
Really grateful.
Very, very useful,
I'm glad.
has high utility.
Get gender bias out there, though.
You did?
Yeah.
Tell me where.
Well, all the pictures.
I'm so glad you're pointing this out to me.
Women are working very hard where you are.
But it's a bias. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to go through and fix that. I really
Oh,
appreciate it. No, I really appreciate it.
No, I think that there's a whole lot of really good work going on. I'm very proud of you. That's super.
Yeah, question back. I think we
Response to treatment, so like in terms of prisoner groups and not prisoner groups, like say you got a kiddo with like the same type of leukemia, the same biomarkers, and looking at actual response to treatment being the same, have you noticed any difference
cancer
between?
treatment?
Yeah, like in terms of life expectancy.
Yeah. Ooh, such a good question. So the question is, can we see differences in survival outcomes and remission rates amongst kids who received PRISM or not in the cancer cohort? We couldn't see that in that phase 2 that I reported. We have a bunch of bigger multi-site studies running right now. 2 are closing to enrollment, either close to enrollment or closing within the next couple months. And those are trying to answer that question. So we, in pediatric cancer, looking at survival outcomes requires very large numbers of patients, and I'm not sure we will have those kinds of numbers in these studies. But I'll tell you the 2 ways we're trying to answer that question. In the one study that has closed to enrollment is amongst patients who are getting a bone marrow transplant. And we looked biologically at a couple of things. We looked at their time to engraftment, their other rates of inflammatory types of responses like graft versus host disease. And we're looking at an epigenetic type of marker that essentially looks at how people turn on or off inflammatory cytokine release. So we're going to try to at least have a sense of, is this making any biologic difference? And then the second question that is really more what you're going at is, in a cohort of patients with incurable cancer, can we see some types of differences in survival time? I think the answer to that is probably going to be no, because in our cohort of a little over 100 people so far, 30% have died, and it's just going to be too soon. We're just not going to have the tail of survival time to really measure that. Let me see. Jenny, last question.
On a related note, thinking about palliative care, one of the landmark articles was Jen Timmel's work on the fact that for adults with pancreatic cancer who were randomized to receive palliative care or not, one of the unexpected findings was that those who received palliative care had a statistically longer length of life. And do we think that PRISM or other factors that come with palliative care may be the answer for that missing ingredient that we have spent the last decade trying to uncover with improving palliative care?
Yeah, so thanks for saying that. I'm going to paraphrase for those on Zoom. Jenny was referencing the 2010 Jennifer Timmel journal paper, which in palliative care world is our sentinel paper. And what Dr. Temmel did was she randomized patients who had thoracic cancers to early palliative care or not, and demonstrated that those who got early palliative care compared to usual care had not only improved quality of life, but longer survival. So here's my sort of I have two cynical thoughts with that. So since Jennifer's Sentinel paper came out, they have done the same type of study in people with GI cancers, in people with blood cancers. They're not seeing the same effect as much. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is palliative care has become more normed. So in the early 2000s when that study ran, it was very rare to have palliative care, and so they could see a real quick, strong impact. And now there's sort of a dilutional effect, number one. Number two, the heterogeneity of experiences, for example, with folks with blood cancers and their survival times is just going to, again, dilute what we can see as a signal from an intervention like palliative care. Number three, I think part of why they saw what they saw was that a lot of the patients in the palliative care arm of her study in cancer patients were choosing not to get experimental, potentially toxic targeted therapies at the time. So their life expectancy was probably more that to take medicines that made them sick, which is important, but it's not quite that palliative care saved them. It's that palliative care helped them avoid things that were causing harm. And the last sort of cynical thing I think in pediatrics is our life expectancies in pediatrics are years sometimes, folks who are getting palliative care. And so how we will see that, we were talking about this with the palliative care team earlier this morning, I think in our research, what we measure as impactful is really the kicker, like how we measure impact. And I'm not sure it's going to be life expectancy. I think it's going to be things like mental health and quality of life and other process measures that demonstrate value. Right.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosenberg. There's a little reception.